one of the most important questions we all need to ask ourselves as we approach retirement is, how much money can I spend each year without having to worry about running out of money during my lifetime? Now, many of us have heard of the 4% rule, but I would argue there's a lot of us that could be spending more than 4%. You know, the difference between spending 4% a year on your account and 5%, that's 25% more. That's a lot more. And in fact, some people could be spending 5.2%. That's 30% more than the 4% rule. Or 5.6%. That's 40% more than the 4% rule. So these seemingly small changes in distribution rates can have a big impact on the ability of you to be able to enjoy your retirement. So let's go for a walk and let's talk about distribution rates. So the 4% rule, famously developed by a gentleman by the name of Bill Bengen, and he did what's called a Monte Carlo simulation, basically a statistical method to look at historical data over 30-year periods with a 50-50 portfolio. And what Bill Bengen found is a 4% distribution rate over a 30-year period, looking at the history. I believe he went back to like the 1920s. Over the history, you had over a 90% likelihood of not running out of money using real returns. So that was a seminal, that was an important study. But if you use 4%, you might be leaving a lot of money on the table. And you may look back later and say, you know, I could have spent a lot more money. So let's talk about some of these other rules. So there's a gentleman by the name of Jonathan Guyton that looked at what Bill Bengen did, and he said, you know, that's not how humans act. You know, the 4% rule, let's just say that you had $800,000 saved for retirement. The 4% rule would say that you could take out $32,000 a year in the first year, and then every year after that, you inflate it, you increase it by the rate of inflation so that your purchasing power stays the same. But what Jonathan Guyton said is, yeah, I don't know about the rest of the world, but that's not how my family acts. You know, when there's tough times, we cut back. And so Guyton said, you know, what if we put guardrails on this? And I'm not going to go into a lot of details on this, but I will put links where you can find out more. But with these guardrails, what Guyton found is if you had a 65% portfolio, now remember, Bengen was half stocks, half bonds. Guyton said if you were 2/3 stocks, 1/3 bonds, and if you put these guardrails when times are tough, you don't spend as much. You don't give yourself that raise the following year. You don't give yourself the inflation adjustment. If you do that, then you can increase your distribution rate up to 5.2% to 5.6%. That's huge. That's a big, big difference. As I said, that's 5.2 instead of 4. That's a 30% increase in how much you're spending a year. And instead of $32,000, roughly, you're going to be spending $42,000. Instead of $32,000, if you increase it by 40%, you're going to be spending roughly $44,000. That's an extra $12,000 a year, and that, you know, that's an extra trip. That's a couple extra vacations for many of us. So it makes a big difference. Okay, so that's how you can possibly increase how much you spend by 30 to 40%, which again, I would say is huge. Now, this is not financial advice for anybody. I don't know your specific situation. And as you're seeing here, figuring out how much money you can spend in retirement without having to worry about running out of money is really important. And I would say it's well worth the investment in a fee-only financial advisor to help you figure out what those numbers are for you. But there's another gentleman, Michael Kitces, Kitces. Michael Kitces says, you know, in over half of these Monte Carlo simulations, which is basically financial advisors simulating 1,000 different outcomes or 10,000 outcomes, by definition, half of those outcomes do better than the median. and half do worse. Well, what if you get lucky? You know what this sustainable withdrawal rate is designed to protect you from is what financial advisors call sequence of return risk. What we're trying to protect you from is if you have negative stock market returns, having to sell at depressed stock market prices. You become, unfortunately, and this is one of the number one rules in financial planning, is try to avoid being a forced seller in a down stock market, right? If you had $1 million and the market went up and down, you'd kind of be indifferent as long as you're not taking money out. And if you're adding money to it, theoretically, you're kind of hoping that there's some negative years so that you can buy in at low prices and have it go back up when time's on your side and you're putting money in. But the inverse of that's called, what I just mentioned is called, a lot of people would call that dollar cost averaging. The ugly cousin to dollar cost averaging is sequence of return risk, which is when you're taking money out. And that can, just like dollar cost averaging can help you out over time, sequence of return risk can hurt you. But the reality is, you know, a lot of us, many of us are not going to be hurt by sequence of return risk. People that retired in 2006, 2007, 2008, they were hurt by sequence of return risk. People that retired in 1998, 1999, just before the dot-com bubble, they were hurt by sequence of return risk. But you know what? People that retired in 2010, you know, they had one of the longest bull markets in U.S. history that helped them out. And should those people be limiting themselves to 4% withdrawal rates? Probably not. They're probably sacrificing unnecessarily. And that's what Michael Kitces, Kitces, that's what Michael Kitces looks at and says, you know, what are the withdrawal rates that would have worked? And, you know, they go all the way up almost to 10%, depending on I believe it was early 1960, that it's almost a 10% withdrawal rate. And so what Kitces says is you start at 4%, but you ratchet up as time goes and you realize you have more money. Again, in the case of somebody with $800,000, Kitces would say, and this is just a high overview, when your portfolio increases, if you're fortunate enough, you're in retirement, you're taking out your 4%, but it increases by 150%. So instead, you start with 800,000, you take out your 32,000, which is 4%. But even though you're taking that money out, because you got fortune and the stock market's doing well, if that 800,000 increases by 150%, which would be $1.2 million, then you give yourself a raise. You start spending 10% more. And then, you know, by definition, the next year, it's as likely that your portfolio is still going to be up 150% because it's already there. So Kitces would say we've got to give it a breathing period. If you're still up by 150%, 3 years later, give yourself another 10% raise. So be sure to look in the show notes. I want you to better understand it. Again, the goal of this video is to put it on your radar screen. I also want you to watch this video where the goal is to enjoy your retirement, and that's why that video is called 5 Reasons to Retire as Soon as You Can. I'll see you in there. Bye-bye.